One morning, as she describes it, Jenny Odell was driving down from Santa Cruz toward Elkhorn Slough. Turning off of Highway 1, she took side roads that wound past rolling golden hills and led through tunnels of oak trees. She saw the scenery, but didn't really take it in, as she was just weighed down by the day's news, by the state of the world. Then she turned a corner, and the wildlife refuge opened out in front of her. And Odell, as she recounts in her book, How to Do Nothing, experienced a miracle. The bright, clear sky was a brilliant blue. A light breeze wafted in, carrying the scent of the sea. Thousands of birds swooped and rose, dove and soared, glittering black and silver, dancing overhead. In an instant, she was crying. She suddenly had an intensely visceral, and I would add spiritual, understanding that we are all connected. In her words, she experienced that terrifying realization that your fate is linked to someone else's, that you are no longer your own. Odell reflects, but isn't that closer to the truth anyway? Our fates are linked, each to the other, to the places where we are, and everyone and everything that lives in them. How much more real my responsibility feels when I think about it this way. This is more than just an abstract understanding that our survival is threatened by global warming, or even a cerebral appreciation for other living beings and systems. Instead, this is an urgent personal recognition that my emotional and physical survival are bound up with these strangers, not just now, but for life. My emotional and physical survival are bound up with all these so-called strangers. It's not that we don't know this, but often we are not living as if this truth is an urgent, personal responsibility. And then we hear this morning's parable from the Gospel of Luke. We often think of parables as having some kind of reversal or unexpected flipping of roles. The foreigner becomes neighbor. A tiny seed becomes home for many animals. A single coin becomes the cause for great rejoicing. This parable is a different type, one Jesus' listeners would have been familiar with because it is so like the parable that the prophet Nathan told to King David. In case you don't remember, because it's been a long time since we've heard it, after David has taken Bathsheba, God sends in the prophet Nathan. Nathan tells King David about a rich man who has stolen a poor man's single lamb. The king becomes enraged and pronounces a harsh verdict for the rich man. Then, of course, Nathan gets to proclaim, "You are the man," revealing King David's self-indictment over his actions. Through this story, King David was able to recognize, finally, the gravity of his sin. according to New Testament and Jewish Studies professor Dr. Amy Jill Levine. The shock of Nathan's parable is not an unexpected role reversal, but rather that the protagonist is the target. She argues that any time we hear a parable from Jesus about a rich man who, we ought to be put in mind of this earlier parable. Audiences in both times would have expected the rich to exploit the poor. This type of parable's power lies in its ability to reveal a known truth in such a way that it ceases to be an abstract understanding and becomes an urgent, personal responsibility. Perhaps our minds start to wander a little when we hear gospel stories about barns and grain. Maybe it would help if we swapped the images for stocks and savings accounts. The stocks of a comfortably middle-class person produced abundantly. And the person said to themselves, "You have ample savings laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said, "You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. Yikes. I wonder if you're caught by this parable like I am. To be clear, not all of us are in the same place. Many have never received an inheritance, nor have ever known what it is like to have such abundance that you can plan for the years ahead. And it is not saving for the future itself that is problematic here. God's covenanted people often store up during times of abundance to prepare for times of drought. And it is not even the relaxing drinking and merrymaking that the parable takes issue with, because in fact, that is the proper response called for by the Hebrew Scriptures in response to the goodness of God's gifts and blessings. But the rich protagonist of this parable celebrates alone. He looks at all he has and says to himself, "This goodness is all for me. I will keep it for myself. I will hoard the abundance that God's earth has produced." The rich man forgets that his survival is bound up with everything and everyone around him. He thinks that what he has can protect against future uncertainty. We know that this simply isn't true. We know that our stuff doesn't keep us safe. Try as we might to plan, we can't prevent global pandemics, political upheaval, market volatility, or personal health crises from upending our lives. "You fool" sounds a bit harsh coming from God, and I don't really recommend it as a response to the next family member who shares what you think is a poor life choice. But I wonder if deep down we already know that it's foolish, the ways we try to store up treasure for ourselves alone. Maybe we just don't know what else to do. Jesus offers another way, a different lens through which to judge our safety, our future, our lives. Am I becoming rich towards God? What priorities do our finances reflect? What would it say if we looked at our budgets as theological statements? Does our notion of security include the fate of our neighbors? Are we living as if we are part of a much, much wider community with impacts on a system far beyond our immediate family? The truth of our deep connectedness may not come in a flash of insight, a miraculous and sudden knowing, as it did for Jenny Odell that afternoon in the slough. More often, it's something we have to learn to live into. It's something we practice year by year, decision by decision, moment by moment. I think there are probably as many ways of living it out as there are people gathered here this morning. But a common marker might be whether we are seeing more and more that our fates are linked to each other, to the places where we are, and everyone and everything that lives in them. If you find yourself being revealed in this parable, take heart. There is room to recognize our responsibility and use a new lens. Let us eat, drink, and be merry together, knowing that we are not our own, but that our emotional and physical survival is bound, each of us, one to the other.